comfortable. And so if at any point you need to take a sip of Gatorade, or I know it's going to be warm with us in here, just let us know. It should be happy to take a break.
Alrighty.
Great. So I'll be leading us off. Everyone will jump in with questions along the way, though. No pressure. All right, we all good? All right, I'll start us off and say that this is Anna Hamilton. I'm with the University of Florida's Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. Today, I have to double check, is Friday, September 8th, 2023, and it's almost 1:30 in the afternoon. Will you introduce yourself and spell your name for us, please?
Okay, I am Darlene Colon, Darlene, and I'm president of the Christiana Historical Society, as well as a descendant of the Resistance participants.
Fabulous. Thank you for having us today.
Well, thank you.
Pleasure and a delight to speak with you. Where and when were you born?
I was born just a little east of here in Coatesville. When? It was January of 1954.
Thank you. And tell us a little bit about your family history.
Okay, family history is lots of Underground Railroad activity, either freedom seekers or those who were participated in the Underground. So that I just found out I won't say 30 years ago, but it was 30 years ago, and I was amazed and proud, and am now working to tell that story.
And so who were, bring us back into kind of the history of your family. Who were those people? Okay.
Would have been my third great grandfather here in Christiana, Ezekiel Thompson. He was known as the Indian Negro. He appeared here around 1830 and stayed here and was quite happy here, raised his children here. And he partnered with William Parker. They had their own secret society because, unfortunately, in this area, there was a group that were known to kidnap blacks in the area and sell them, take them to Maryland to sell them. He partnered along with William Parker, and when they found out someone had been kidnapped, they found out the route that was being used, and they would run and get ahead of them, ambush them, and take that person back. So Ezekiel was a part of that. So I was like, yay.
The resistance.
Yes, yeah, that started it.
And I noticed that you said he appeared here.
Yeah.
Is there a sense of where he came from?
He came from the Eastern Shore in Maryland. We believe he was part of the Nanticoke tribe because they were on the Eastern Shore, and there are still Thompson families there. So we are busy tracing them, trying to connect. But that group has since moved into Dover, Delaware. But we found a Thompson family cemetery there, so we're connecting. We're connecting. So yeah, the story continues.
The end is, or the beginning is still yet to be written.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yes. And with Ezekiel, his three sons, even after the resistance and the beginning of the Civil War, they all fought in the Civil War, various United States Colored Troops regiments, and sadly only one lived through the Civil War. But we're here and we're telling that story.
Love that.
Yes.
What brought him here?
I'm sure it was seeking freedom, seeking a way to live and to have family. He had 4 children. Well, he had 5 actually. One died. His wife actually died shortly after he was here. We found records from a gentleman who was a funeral director where he buried Zeke's wife and child. So he had 3 more after that. So we constantly looking. I'm sure, like I said, he came here for freedom. He was a farmer. He stayed here and he farmed until he died, which was in 1878.
I'm thinking about you tracing the story and trying to put these pieces together. Mm-hmm. You mentioned it's something that you found out about 30 years ago.
Yes.
Tell me about that moment.
Well, that was actually, I was saying that was at a funeral, and my mother was discussing family history, and we started talking, and I'm like, wait a minute. And I'm like, I didn't know anything about this. And she's like, yeah, well, we don't talk about that. And I'm like, you need to talk about that. And I said, I'm going to get in trouble because I'm going to start talking about that. And it just so happened it was around the time they were planning the 150th anniversary of the resistance. So that's when I got involved. And I've been involved ever since. We created the Historical Society at that point.
I hate to pause, but I want to make sure that we're hearing you clearly. Would it be possible for us to ask them to speak a little more quietly?
Well, that door is locked. I'd have to go out.
Is it clear enough, or is it?
It won't be, you'll hear it, but it's not nearly as loud as we're hearing it.
Okay.
Because the microphones, is where the sound is coming in.
Because I think he's loud when he's on the phone. So it's like.
Okay.
I mean, it will be fine.
Okay.
I could probably filter that out. I don't like to admit it.
That's true. I just want to make sure that's okay with you all.
It is what it is.
Okay.
We'll hear you clearly.
Okay.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you. Just wanted to check.
Yeah.
So that sounds like a really pivotal moment where you've learned from your family, and it sets you off on this trajectory personally and professionally. I'm curious, why is it something that wasn't talked about in your family?
I think that carries over from the time of the underground and seeking freedom, when they were afraid to say anything because they were afraid slave catchers would be coming and they would be dragged back. So it's hush. Everything was hush.
And so what are some of those details that you learned from your mom as you started to put that together, as the stories were passed down through the generations?
Right. Well, I found that our family there's a church just up the street, the only African-American church in the area, Mount Zion AME Church, and Ezekiel was a part of that church. And they were founded in 1814, one of the oldest African-American churches in Lancaster County. He attended that church. He's buried there. As well as at least one of his sons are buried there. The family has been at that church ever since. So that I was like, well, I'm really proud of that. And we continue. Like I said, I'm passing this on to my children. Finally got Mom to start talking about that. And sadly, we just lost her last year. She was 100 years old. So she had a lot to tell once we could get her to talk about it. So yeah, we're still learning.
Yeah, I'm sorry about your mom.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Yeah, she lived a good life. She's spunky till the end, just like Zeke. Yeah.
Was that a hard transition for her to have grown up not speaking about this, but now you have this blooming curiosity from you and your kids? She
really became to embrace it especially once we got the Historical Society going, and she never missed a meeting. She was there all the time. One of her children was going to take her to that meeting. So yeah, she was very adamant about that, and she got a few of her cousins involved. And she kept saying, I don't know anything, but we actually set up a camera and got her and her cousins in a room together, and boy, they started chatting, and things were coming out. We're like, oh, we thought you didn't know anything. And she was like, well, that didn't count. But yeah, she was.
What was her name?
Her name was Anna Thompson Taylor.
Wonderful. And as you were listening to them kind of recount some of this stuff that she didn't know,
right?
What were you surprised to learn?
Well, I was just surprised to learn all of this, that they had been, the family still, they call it on the hill, which is where Mount Zion is, on the hill, the church up on the hill. The family's still on the hill. The family still attends that church. It was amazing how it was hushed through the whole family. Nobody talked about it, and even my grandfather, I never heard him talk about it. And one time I got one of my great uncles to say just a little bit. He talked about it, but it wasn't a lot. So it was like pulling teeth to get them to really come out and talk about that. But what amazed me, and it was part of the story of the resistance, when Ezekiel was arrested and taken to prison, that they said he prayed so loudly and so fervently that people on the street stopped, and they would stand there and listen to him, the entirety of his prayer. So I'm like, well, that kudos to Mount Zion, because that's where he was.
Is there a record of what the specific prayer was?
No, not that I have found at this point. Let me say that. I will continue to dig, but not at this point. It was just remarked about how people would just stop on the street and listen.
And since you mentioned that, will you kind of walk us back and tell us the story of Ezekiel as it pertains to the resistance?
Well, as I said, he came here around 1830. He was an older gentleman at the time of the resistance. He was in his 50s, but still didn't stop him participating. He was very adamant about assisting, helping people keep their freedom. The day of the resistance, he was one of the first ones there once they sounded the alarm that they needed help. And it's remarked in the records from the trials that he said he wanted to get a hold of the marshal that came here, because the marshal was not one of the, well, he wasn't a real truth teller, he was. And he said he would have been happy to go to the gallows if he would have got a hold of that marshal. That's how straight he was. And while he was in jail, they actually put him in a cell with one of the gentlemen that the slave owner was looking for. And he saw people coming to identify him to take him back. He actually threw a blanket over this man, picked up a stool and stood in front of him. And he dared the two men to come into the cell. And they were like, you know, you can't stop us. He says, first one steps in, I will splinter this stool. So they backed out and shut the door, and they never came in to identify that young man. So I was like, yay. That's my grandpa, yeah.
And talk to us about, I mean, I'm struck when you really think about what it means to put your life on the line.
Yes.
For something, and how you think about that now.
Yeah, I would be right up in front. I think I got a lot of his genes, because I look coming down through the ages. Like I said, his three sons, they continued that fight. They all went in the Civil War. 2 lost their lives for it, but they adamant about that fight. And going through the family history, I'm like, we've had family members in every war, every military service unit. They continue to fight for what's right, for that freedom. They're not going to stop. So I'm proud of that. I'm very proud of that. We've had Navy, Army, Air Force, Marines, mostly Marines, but yeah, they continue, men and women. So we're like, yeah, we're a little spunky. Yeah.
Spunk has a value to pass down.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does.
And thinking too then back to the resistance and Christiana as the central through line for the Underground Railroad, do you have a sense of what the community was like back then and how your family figured into that?
Well, and especially in talking to descendants, the community there was very open and very much about what was morally correct. Here we have the Quakers. The religions were different, the cultures were different, but they saw a moral compass that they all agreed on, and they came together on that, and they all put their lives on the line for that. There were several barns burned here as a warning to some of the Quakers about their participation in assisting freedom seekers, and didn't stop them.
I'm curious how those threats were received in the community.
Well, I think in many cases, I know of a few cases where the people that actually kept records of helping freedom seekers, they burned those records because they didn't want anyone to find out. So we lost a lot of information there, but they were trying to, you know, save their own lives, save their own, like I say, if you burn their barn, they lost their livelihood. And so we've had quite a bit of that. But I think looking back on their thing with God and what's morally right, and these are people, they're not property, they were going to do what was right and take the consequences, which is as they all, when they went to jail, they suffered the consequences willingly.
You anticipated my question, which was, do you have stories of who did come through seeking freedom and who passed through and who your ancestors may have helped?
Well, there were quite a few. There was one gentleman who came through from York, and I believe he was the gentleman who helped the Harper's Ferry, John Brown. Perry Osborne Perry, he went through York, and I believe he made his way through here and on into freedom. We had a lot of people, the four gentlemen that the slave owner was looking for, Josh Hammond, Noel Bewley, and several others. They made their way through here. They became very cunning on how they hid people. I understand they had the big haystacks. They would hide people inside those haystacks. At the time when they actually did the arresting and they were trying to hide people, William Parker got stuck in the home of a Quaker family, thinking he was looking for help, and they surrounded that Quaker's home, thinking they were keeping him out, but actually didn't know that they trapped him inside. So the Quaker, the daughters, the Pownell sisters, actually put him in Quaker clothing. They hid food in the orchard, hid clothing in the orchard, and they waited till the guards fell asleep and walked him right past the guards and got him out of there. They actually arrested Parker's wife and sister-in-law. They were taken to prison. They were going to be taken back to their slave owner in Havre de Grace, Maryland. And they convinced the carriage driver, to bring them back to Christiana because their children were here. And they said, more people, more money. And he fell for that. So he brought them back to Christiana, took them to the house, and they said, we're going to grab all the kids and we'll be right back. Well, they were in the front and out the back and gone. And they found help. A Quaker lady, Nancy Fulton, took them out further into the country, where they met an elderly black lady who took them further out. She says, I know what to do. You leave them with me. They'll be safe. And in the meantime, Parker made his way into Canada. And they followed, I think it was 3 months later, they were able to make it there. So it's a lot of intrigue, and you talk about work together. They had to know who was who and how to get them where, and they did it.
Yeah, it's amazing to hear about these intricacies.
Yeah.
Especially because the railroad was designed to be invisible for good reason.
Right.
How can you talk to us about kind of the infrastructure, for a lack of better words, but like how those channels became established and what role your family played in those?
Well, I'm not sure what role I'm sure they were in there, but just looking at the underground itself, talked to many people from York County. We had William Goodrich, who had trains, and he was a very wealthy entrepreneur, and he built false bottoms in his trains, which went into Columbia, which was Stephen Smith, another African-American entrepreneur. He owned a lumber yard right by the river. He had a gentleman who would row people across the river into Columbia, and again, put them on a train. And the train came right through here, and get on the train, make your way to Philadelphia. And I know there was connections with William Still, because when the slave owner, using the Fugitive Slave Act, went to claim his property to show all his documentation, there was a gentleman there, I believe his name was Samuel Williams. He was cleaning in the office of the magistrate, and he heard them talking. So he slowed down his job so he could get all the information, and he took it to William Still, who told him, get to Christiana and warn them what's coming, which he did. He jumped on the train. He was a little upset because he saw the Gorsuch party on the train, and he was like, oh no. But they luckily got off a stop ahead because they wanted to sneak up on folks and catch them off guard, but that didn't happen.
I'm just so struck by those communication channels, which when we think now that when we each have a piece of technology attached to us, but then it operated in such a different way.
Right. Well, like I say, William Goodrich, for instance, he had a department, what we call a department store now, and he would get word that I'm in need of 6 bolts of fabric and, 2 large bolts and 4 small pieces of trim. And whether the color of that trim would tell him how many men, how many women, how many children. So he knew what to expect. And I believe Stephen Smith, who owned a lumber yard, would use produce, like sacks of potatoes. We've got big 6 sacks of potatoes coming, that. And that's how they would communicate, usually with their business, especially when they were like farmers and businessmen. They would use their business as a way to incorporate how they were sending people through.
Yeah, of course.
I'm Gabrielle Hurd, for the record. It's really cool that you guys were able to find that information because it's so specific, and some things like 6 sacks potatoes or, bolts of fabric is usually lost in history. Where did you find that? Did you find it out from a relative or from records?
Well, that we were researching, actually lots of research, and we found through William Goodrich's records, because he owned a store where he had produce, he had fabric, he had all of these things, and that was a way for him. I guess he devised that so that he could get these people through, and he actually hid them in his home and would take them to the rail cars that he owned for his business, which would go directly into Philadelphia.
So the records were preserved from his business? I
believe so, yes.
Yeah, that's really cool. How did you come to find those records? Like someone who's interested in finding their family's history to do with the Underground Railroad, how would they be able to track down something like that?
Well, it worked out for me because of my interest in history and my participation. I belong to a group called the Past Players, Pennsylvania Past Players. And we become certain characters in history, in which case I have a friend who did William Goodrich and did all the research on William Goodrich. I participate in Lancaster, so I started doing Lancaster County history, and it was like, oh my goodness, look at this, look at that. It's like with Thaddeus Stevens, I found the Civil War records for Ezekiel's sons, and I saw that Thaddeus Stevens' nephew, recruited them. I saw the name of Captain Thaddeus Stevens on their recruitment records, and I was like, oh, well, not only did Thaddeus Stevens help them out as their attorney and in the trials, but they also recruited them to fight for freedom. So it's like we keep finding these connections.
That's really amazing.
Yeah.
You have any questions?
Yeah, I had a question about, my name is Mosunmola, for the record. I had a question about the church. You talked about like the Methodist Church on the Hill. Mm-hmm. What was actually their role during this point in time? Like, what was the contribution of the church to like the freedom seekers?
Oh, I'm sure they were very active. Because most of them, like I said, they were the only African-American church in around, and that's where everybody went to church. It's not even a half a mile up the hill. So everybody gathered there, and I'm sure they were all participants in one way or the other. Actually, when the militia came in from Philadelphia, they went to the church thinking they were hiding people and shot through the doors of the church. The church still has that door encased with all the bullet holes and all the little pellets. They still have it. I understood the Smithsonian was looking for it, but they're like, no. So, but yeah, the church, I'm sure, was very active. Most of those that fought in the Civil War, most of those that were involved with the resistance are buried there. And this, like I say, the church is still very active today.
Even today. Thank you. Mm-hmm. And also a question about, I know you said like the discovery about like the connection with the freedom seekers, like you discovered about it 30 years ago, and you also mentioned like you had to get a camera and do a recording with your mom and all of that. Like, how do we access? So, do you have like the record available? How do we access it if we?
I have to see where we filed that, but
okay.
we do. to see which cousin took that. And to say none of them are alive now. So yeah, we have to find that now that you bring that up. We definitely, actually, we here in Christiana did a lot of recording. We record all of the elders in the community. So I know that they're on tape. I have to see where we hid that. A lot of our documentation is kept in a vault in the library. So that's one of our possible locations to go look for those films. But we do have them all on film.
I think it's so powerful, the story, how you told that your mom always said, I don't know anything. And then you got her with her cousins and she finally felt comfortable enough to talk. Mm-hmm. How do you think for people who want to like foster those conversations in their own family where they like need to talk about something difficult, but need to make their family member feel comfortable enough to talk about it? Like what was that process like to getting to your mom to the place where she felt comfortable talking about that stuff?
Well, I think it was being with her cousins because they were all from the same age range and they're all from the same era and they all had those secrets they had to tell. And they would sit and giggle and start to gossip, and then we would try and just interject a little hint in there, and they're like, oh yeah, do you remember so-and-so did this? And then they would get into a fit of giggles and they would talk some more, and we're like, oh, okay. But yeah, it was just getting them comfort, and we didn't really let them see the camera, we just kind of had it in a corner, and we just let them talk. And like I said, we would throw a few hints in there to try and steer them where we wanted the conversation to go. But yeah, it worked out.
Did your mother not see her cousins very often? Do you think seeing them again kind of stirred those memories for her?
Right. No, they didn't get to see each other that often. Like I said, they were all very elderly and didn't get together that often. I think none of them drove, I don't think. None of them drove. So it was waiting for someone younger to get them together. So we started having gatherings and get them to talk.
That's really beautiful.
So yeah, we started having reunions and gatherings because they're extremely important to get people together and to talk.
What were her cousins' names?
There was Marie Congo. Marie, her grandfather came to this area. He was enslaved. His real name was Mosby, but he changed it to, no, his name was Moses, and he changed it to Mosby to try and hide. We had Juanita Lewis, and like I said, they've all passed. There was Thelma Boehner Thompson. She's gone, but they were all fantastic ladies, and they would have a ball when they got together, and they'd say to sit and chat.
And what was that like for the rest of your family to hear them recounting these stories that had kind of been hidden for so long?
Yeah, we were amazed, and we're like, okay, we got to keep them going. We got to keep them going, and then we have to keep it going. So we had to start working on our generation, the generation after us. At one point, we had 5 generations alive at that time, which was not too often do you see that. So we had to keep it going, and I recruit my kids. Sometimes they're unwilling, but they come. And I keep telling those stories. I'm like, yeah, especially when school time in Black History Month, and I'm like, you have a story to tell. So, get up there and get her done. Because, yeah, this, don't be silent. They're very, very active in the underground.
I'm wondering, how did you decide to pick up the mantle of telling this story? Since for so long it's something that your family's made a choice not to talk about. I'm wondering what compelled you to take kind of the opposite route.
Yeah, it was that because I was never a talker. I didn't talk, don't get me in front of anybody. I couldn't do it, I wouldn't do it. But when I looked at the depth of this story, when I looked at what Zeke did and what he put through, when I started looking at the records, like I said, his sons went on and fought. I got my great-great-grandfather's Civil War records. He died in New Orleans, but his widow was denied a pension, and it's marked on his pension papers, son of Ezekiel Thompson of Christiana Riot. He was denied a pension. His second son, Miller, his wife hired a lawyer. He died. He was in the Battle of Biloxi in Florida. He came back with consumption. He died 3 months after he came back. They refused to give her a pension. So I'm like, yeah, I'm not going to let this rest. So, yeah, we keep telling that story. We keep telling the story. I said, you have to. You have to. It's, you know, what he stood up for, we can't let that. We can't be silent on that.
Yeah, and you can trace these racial punishments throughout your family history.
Right, right. Just because they stood up for what they believed in. And in the words of like William Parker, when the slave owner came to demand his property, and William Parker told him, go to the barn. He said, there's chickens and horses and cows, that's property. There's not property in here, which really upset the gentleman, and the gentleman stepped inside his house and he said, he demanded his property. He says, tables and chairs, take what you want. And he said, no, we're not property, and we won't be property. So I said, we make that stand, keep it going. And I'm so proud of that. And like I said, I've got my son coming, so he's taking up, I've got one. I said, I'm working on the others. I've got a couple of the grandkids going, so I'm like, oh. I actually had one, my great-grandson actually won a contest. It's African-American history, African-American ancestry, something they had a contest on telling your story on Black history, and he won first prize. So I'm like, okay, let's keep it going. Keep it going.
How have you passed that story on to them?
I've been verbally, and by bringing them here, showing them, taking them to other Underground Railroad sites. I've had my son, they've done a lot of filming in Philadelphia, doing various movies, Underground Railroad, in that time period. I've had them there as extras, so they get to dress up, and they loved it. So I'm like, okay, keep going. Yeah, we'll dress. If I have to dress you all up, that's what we're going to do. My granddaughters love the hoop skirts, so I've gotten hoop skirts and all kinds of little things. I said, I'm gonna get you one way or the other.
And what does it mean to them to have this as part of their history?
Well, it depends on which way we are. Some of the guys are really enamored of it. The guys love it because, you know, soldiers and the guns and all that stuff. They love it. The girls, some of them are really taken back by the history, because I actually taught a history class at the high school. It was an after-school program where I had the girls pick a character from the past that would kind of relate to what they want to be in the future. I said, find a lady in the past. I said, because she succeeded, so if she can do it then, nothing should stop you now. So, and they loved putting on the hoop skirts, and they said they felt very regal, and they learned more from that class than they said an actual history class, because they had to research that woman. They had to walk in her shoes, make her decisions, and figure out what she did to become a success. So the same thing with the guys. You know, look at these guys. I said, we had, Stephen Smith was about a millionaire in the 1870s. I said, a Black man. Come on, guys. You can do this, you can do this. But yeah, I try to find examples for them to follow and to look at, and to see, you know, they can do it. I can really do this too. And, you know, they believed. And education. Gotta go to school.
It's very cool to talk about, you're talking about the different ways that you're connecting people to history, and to take away specific values, not just memorize and learn the facts, learn the dates.
Right.
What drives you to do that?
I think it started when I got recruited to be a character from the past. And the more I dug into her, I was like, well, this is really fascinating. And I'm like, well, geez, and the more I talked to other people as that person, they were just like, wow, we didn't know this. I actually had a woman start crying because she's like, I didn't know this. They don't teach this. And I'm like, well, I'm here. To get the young girls to do that, they were just really fascinated with that. And then when they're in the hoop skirts, and then we see a little 5-year-old come through and say, they're princesses. Look at all the princesses. And they get a kick out of that. But the hard part for them was learning how to let the gentleman open the doors and let the gentleman help. She said, I can open the door myself. I'm like, no, you're not you. You have to let them do that. But yeah, it's fascinating.
And what was the name of your character? Who did you play?
I am Lydia Hamilton Smith, business partner to Thaddeus Stevens. And she was an entrepreneur in her own right. She owned, a home in Gettysburg. She owned 6 properties in Lancaster. She had a boarding house in Washington, D.C. I'm told she had a property in Philly, which I'm researching. But she's quite a wealthy lady. She had railroad stock. So I'm like, this lady's doing this in 1860 and 1870? Oh, come on, yeah. So when she died, she had an estate of over $25,000 in 1880, which is something like $500,000 today. So I'm like, I said she was a woman of color. She was a widow. She was raising 2 sons alone. Come on.
And what was the context in which you were Lydia?
Actually, we had one of our events here, and there was a gentleman here, and he was portraying Thaddeus, and he had a lady who was Lydia, and I'm like, who? So he told me about her. I'm like, I've never heard of her. So about a few months later, I saw him at another event, a Civil War encampment, and I'm like, well, where's Lydia? He said she had other things to do. He said, why don't you do it? And I'm like, huh? I don't know anything about her. He says, I'll send you some stuff. And I'm like, oh, okay. So that was 20 years ago. So I've been doing Lydia ever since. And it's just been, and it's amazing that people are like, she did what? She had what? I'm like, yes. Her house in Lancaster still stands. As a matter of fact, the Historical Society, they're redoing the houses. They're going to renovate and make a museum for Thaddeus and Lydia's homes, the Stevens and Smith site.
That's amazing. Yeah, I did want to ask you, because we have a big day coming up tomorrow for you all. Will you tell us about some of the interpretive work that you've managed to do and what's coming up tomorrow and some of the plans that you've mentioned to us off the record?
Yes. Well, tomorrow, Lydia will be here to tell the story in Thaddeus' stead. She'll be telling the story and telling his part in the resistance. We will have Civil War reenactors to tell the story of those who fought in the war. First Pennsylvania Reserves, as well as the United States Colored Troops, will be here. We have a tinsmith. We have a lady spinning wheel and weaving. She'll be doing that. We will have descendants here, both Quaker and African American. We will have, let me see, my goodness, lots of food. There will be Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts doing activities for children, lots of children's games, things to get the children involved in. We have a magician from that time period. We have a U.S. Marshal from that time period. And a few civilians who will be wandering about. The library has an exhibit. The Masonic Lodge, which is where our exhibitors are, our tinsmith and others will be. We have several authors who will be in the area. Harry Kendall, who wrote Truth Crushed to Earth. And there's a young lady by Christina, and I don't remember her last name. She just wrote a book which will be published in November on Christiana. We will have an author who wrote books on drummer boys, Civil War drummer boys. which I think the kids will find fascinating. He's got all the paraphernalia drummer boys used. So we've got a lot going on. The Civil War reenactors will be doing a weapons demonstration, so they'll be firing off a few shots, which I have to call the police and remind them, so we don't. But yeah, so it'll be a full day. It'll be a full day. Lots to see, lots of people to talk to, lots to experience.
And how long has the festival been happening?
Oh my. We have been doing this ever since, started in 2001. Like I was saying, prior to that, they only did it every 50 years.
50 or 15?
50, 5-0. And they couldn't figure out why nobody knew anything. I said, because you do it and they die off. So in 2001, when I became president, we started picking up the frequency. We started every 5 years, and I've gotten it to every year. So except we had COVID, we had 2 years we didn't do anything, but we're picking it up with a lot of steam. Like I said, and we're doing all these plans that we want to do. So we're excited. We're excited.
And tell us about some of the plans too. I know you mentioned them to us earlier.
Oh yeah, the plans. We have a home that's been vacant for 20 years, and it was built by an abolitionist, William Penn Britton, and they have a home in Chester County, the Britton home, which is Revolutionary era, and we're the Civil War era here. And we're restoring that home. That will be the home for the Historical Society. We have found a home or a house that was the exact same dimensions and era that the William Parker house was. And we're going to take it apart brick by brick and bring it here and put it back together. And hopefully with some students and some others who want to learn masonry and carpentry and all of those things, they'll be helping us do that. And then there's a barn over there that we want to turn into either conference center and or Underground Railroad escape room. So we want to have like a little history campus, a little educational center for people. And of course we'll be telling this story and other stories as we find them.
That's fabulous. Yeah, I'm struck that as you are learning more about your personal history, there's also this much more public hunger for these stories and to learn more about these events.
Right.
I'm wondering, can you talk about how the community has received these efforts and the ramping up of these efforts?
Oh yeah, well it was slow at first because they're like, nah, yeah, that's a lot. But because I think initially they wanted to tear down the house or sell it or get rid, but we're like, no. We have plans. And as I said, the house sat vacant for close to 20 years and had a lot of mold and other issues on it. And the community really came together to help us get new joists to put in there. I mean, they jumped at that, and now we're citing for grants and trying to get that together. We hope to have that done within a year or so, not much longer, and to have it maybe by the next year this time, we'll have the house open.
It's very exciting.
Yeah, it is. And then, coupled with this room, which has so much information and the things that we have stored away, and people are donating things, from their house. This is old from my grandmother, and I don't, to take it. And so we're storing it so that we'll have lots of exhibits when we get open.
I'm curious what kind of artifact, what are people
Well, one lady gave us an actual old fireplace mantle. And we're like, oh, okay, that's great. And another lady called and she has a quilt. So that we have this quilt, and they're giving us some old copper bowls and silver and the pitchers and all kinds of things all of a sudden are coming in, and we're like, okay, thank you. Yes, we will take them. We will store them. We're excited. We're excited.
Really special items to have.
Oh yes, yeah. So we can't wait. We can't wait. So we've all got. We say we're getting older. We got to get this done. and working hard to bring in the next generation to keep it going, because that's extremely important for us.
What other questions do you all have?
How do you see the next generation coming in and getting excited? Like, what do you think they're going to want to do after you guys are done with all your plans? Like, how do you see the historical society in, I don't know, 30 years?
Oh, wow. Yeah. Well, if I make it good, I'll be like my mother. I'll be 100. So hopefully, because they have all the tech. So they'll be thinking up things to do and how to draw folks in using technology and programming. That's the big thing. They'll think of programming that we can do to draw their generation in and maybe tell the story in a different way other than just one person standing there telling the story. Or because I like to have people come in, because to me it's one-on-one now. And the in character does a lot, but the people, they really love that when, one-on-one. And as long as we stay in character, which we've become very good at, we actually had a young kid ask Lydia where she was from, and she said, she's from Lancaster. And he said, I got her. And he said, and where do you live in Lancaster? And my reply was, well, you can come visit me. I have a very small apartment in St. Mary's Cemetery. And he was like, oh, wow. I'm like, yeah. But yeah, we have to craft things in a certain way and be in awe of certain new things that we see when we're here. And they love that. So the kids, the younger, they kind of like to catch on to that because they like to fool people. So yeah. Any way we can try to get them to come in. But yeah, I think the newer generations will be looking a lot more at technology to draw them in. And I'm looking forward to any way we can get it to work.
Yeah, I have a question about, this, I don't know, this is like really transformative, and you've spoken a lot about like really fascinating stories about how you've literally taken it from nothing to, having this very visible history about the resistance and about, the freedom seekers. So what has been the challenges in sharing this rich history? What are some of the challenges you faced and other people who have been a part of this initiative?
Well, a lot of the challenges have been and I hate that it's out there, is racism. There are people who don't want to hear the story, don't want to believe the story. And sadly, sometimes we have to have a police presence around because someone may just not want to hear it or want to cast a negative context in things. And we're like, because even when we tell the story, because they talk about slave owners, and we don't put a bad light on Mr. Gorsuch or his family. He was following the law. He did, as he said, give them their freedom when they reached a certain age, and he did not feel he was a bad person. And so we don't say, ooh, slave owners, ooh, this, ooh, that. No. Everybody had their role to play in this history. So we're just trying to keep it as factual as possible. We're not trying to put a bad light on anyone, but we want the story to be told. So we tell it as well as we can so that no one is put in a negative connotation. So, and like I said, we just fear that people who like to stir up. When we had our 2001 event, our 150th, it was the KKK was going to make a presence known. But luckily we had a large presence here, so they took it into Lancaster City. So I'm like, fine, keep it away from here. But no, we are a very close community here, and we still help one another regardless of culture, regardless of race, regardless of religion. We still come together here. It's like on Sunday, we're having a church service with 5 different churches all around here. So we continue to look for ways to come together and to help each other. So that's what we want to put out there and keep out there. And just keep it in the back of our mind. We don't keep an eye out for any naysayers.
Well, now, I mean, that you mentioned that, like, how has, I mean, we're talking about decades that you all have been working on research and refining, like, the storytelling, the curation, ways that you reach folks about this history. How has the political climate changed over time, or?
Well, the past few years, the political climate has been not that positive. But we keep trying to twist it away and turn it back to where we want it to be, where we feel it needs to be, in order for us to grow, in order for our community to grow. So we keep it going, and we try to get into as many schools as we can. Like I said, homeschoolers will come here, and very welcoming, and we look at that riot or resistance type, you know, what was it? How did they come together? How did they work together? All of these people that were willing to go to jail to stand up for this. You had Thaddeus Stevens, who actually lost his seat in Congress because he helped. He was one of the lead defense attorneys, and he lost his seat in Congress because of that. But he said it was the right thing to do. So we're going to keep plugging away. And we have 2001, we had what we called a forgiveness dinner. And it was including the Gorsuch family, the Quaker families, the African-American families, the Parkers that came down from Canada. Our host was the great-great-grandson of Frederick Douglass. And tears and hugs and talks. And when you talk about not talking, because the Parker family had no clue as to what went on down here. And the gentleman, Frank, he said, I had to come all these miles to find out that his great-great-grandfather was a hero and what he did. And he had, I mean, the tears. I mean, everybody was bawling that night. So it was, but we just came together, and it was just phenomenal.
I feel like I got goosebumps. How did that get organized? How did you all set that up?
Oh my, we took a trip to Canada, Historical Society. We went to Canada because in Buxton, where Parker ended up, they have a homecoming every year, Labor Day, which is the week before we do our celebration. So we went up and we started talking, and then we knew our anniversary was coming, so we said, we're gonna plan this, we're gonna invite them. We got a big grant so that we could bring them down, and it just worked out. And we said, we want to have a dinner. We want to bring everybody together. So we had a 3-day event. You know, we had the day when we had all the activities going on in town. We had a big parade. We dedicated the monument outside, which was funny because we said, everybody hold hands around the monument, and we gave a little blessing, and we looked up, and there were the Parkers and the Gorsuches holding hands. And somebody said, get a camera, and they did not know who they were. They did not know each other. They were just standing there holding hands. So we're like, oh my gosh, come on, we have to, you know, keep that in memory. But yeah, it was just a wonderful time.
And were they aware of the extent of their ancestors' roles in this history?
They became aware. And they sat with each other at dinner, and they talked, and like I said, everybody was hugging and talking, and they're like, well, that was then, this is now. We're moving forward. And it was just wonderful. The Gorsuch family actually invited the Historical Society down to their plantation, which they still owned at that time. And the story, and it was a fascinating story because the youngest son, Tom, was not permitted to come along on the venture with his brother. And when he found out his father was killed, he was in boarding school. And he and his best friend commiserated together, and his friend helped him through his grief. And then after the trial, when they found out that it was not guilty, no one would be charged with his father's death. You talk about anger, and they talked about revenge. And when they took us down to show us where the boarding school was, it's now a really fancy restaurant, but they still had the records from the boarding school. So we went through and we're looking, we're like, okay, there's Tom Gorsuch, da-da-da-da-da. And then we looked over and we saw his roommate, John Wilkes Booth. We were like, what? We said, are you serious? So we were just like, that was just phenomenal for us. We just couldn't get over it. And it turns out these two families, both from England, were very close. And we were like, holy cow. And that was the same thing when William Parker was making his way to Canada. He got stuck in Rochester, couldn't get over into Canada, and found a friend. They were children together on the same plantation. They were enslaved. Frederick Douglass. So we were like, the story just keeps getting better and better. So we're like, yeah. So, and we hold tight to this story because there have been a few who trying to, there was some gentleman who, Hawaii, who wanted to write a play on the resistance, and he sent it to us, and we're like, this is nothing like what happened. And he wanted us to give our approval, and we're like, no. So we watch whenever we see something coming out on Christiana, we're right there.
Yeah, I'm curious. What is that legacy? I mean, it's multiple things where there's the history of what happened here, but now also because of the scrutiny over historical narratives. Mm-hmm. How does the community deal with that? I don't have a great way to phrase that. Sorry.
Yeah, but no, we're very, like I say, we have an eye out, and we scan through YouTube and all this, because I found a few things on YouTube, and I've contacted and invited them here because I'm like, excuse me, why don't you come over and see us before you put this out? And they either ignore me or I keep bugging them. But I'm like, and I make little comments, you need to correct this or you need to correct that. But yeah, we're very, like I say, we have to keep an eye out on what goes on. Because we had a couple people from California, directors, want to come out and want to do a story, and we're like, okay, but we need to see it before you put anything out. And they're like, oh.
So the community is obviously very protective of the legacy.
Very, very. If you talk to, and especially the members of the Historical Society, if you talk to any of them, they're like, and what are you saying? And how are you going to say it? And they will be very point blank. You keep it true to what it is. You're not going to skew it in one way or another.
It's a full-time job.
Yeah, it is. Yes, it is. And that's why we recruit these younger ones. Keep an eye out.
That's it. I'm curious, because Christiana occupies such an important place in the Underground Railroad history, are there specific sites here or around the community that you all feel need a designation or a preservation of some sort, either as an Underground Railroad site or just, I guess, otherwise in general?
Well, sadly, like I say, the house is gone. The Parker house is gone. They pushed that in around 1898, but we do have a marker on the road, a state marker. This is probably one of the last buildings left because they brought Gorsuch's body here for the inquest, and then they held all the African-American prisoners up on the 3rd floor, waiting for the train to take them to Philadelphia to prison. There's not much left. So, here, and then the site where the resistance held, the farms, the Quaker farms, a lot have been taken over by the Amish. So there's not a whole lot we can do there. But we're allowed to do drive-bys to show you where the properties are, because we've mapped out a lot of the properties. One thing about the Quakers is wonderful journals and diaries. So we have a lot of information through them.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah. No, you're good. You're good. I just have one more question, and then we'll start to wrap up. And that is, you have been able to follow kind of the tendrils of all of these unknown stories and piece together a lot of information you didn't know before. What are some of the lingering questions that you have that you wish you could resolve? Or what are some of the kind of breadcrumbs that you are following that you want to lead somewhere? Like, what are the burning questions you still have?
Well, the questions are, well, a lot of the African Americans that were arrested, they just kind of scattered. So I'm trying very hard to find those descendants, because there may be bits and pieces of stories that they have that they don't realize are associated. It's just like, I think it was 4 years ago, one of the gentlemen, Peter Woods, who was involved, we found a descendant, but they had no idea. Someone else just happened to be researching, and hey, this was your great-great-grandfather. They're like, yeah, well, he was in the resistance. They're like, what? So, you know, there's still a lot. There's 30-some names on that memorial out there, and we're trying to find them. We're trying to find them. Matter of fact, we're planning to work with the library in the spring to hold a genealogy conference. And I'm going to list the names of all of those that are on that monument. And like, do you know, is this your name? Could this be your relative? Is there some stories hidden that you don't know? So to get people to come out and start talking. So that's one of our hopes, but that's the biggest thing. Where did they all go? Did they change their names? Some changed their names. So yeah, we're looking.
You'll have to keep us posted so that we can come back and talk to you and learn what you learned. Yeah. We're really excited about that. Once we get this big weekend over, we're gonna focus on that genealogy thing. And come on, people, we know you're there. We know you're there. Yeah, we for a long time we had lost William Parker, but we found him in Ohio, and. So we're trying to track down he had married another woman, and her family, we understand, are still in the area, but hello. we need to find them and see what they know. Because apparently he started a Masonic lodge in Ohio and some other things. So I'm like, we're looking for you. Yes. Well, good. Well, my last question is, if you had the chance to speak to Ezekiel now, what would you want to know from him, or what would you want to tell him?
Oh, geez. One thing, I'd like to know exactly where he came from, because it's like he just popped out of the blue. He's here, and I would like him to see that we're carrying on the story. I'd like him to see that we're still fighting that fight, and that we're still standing up. And we're going to keep going. Let him know, yeah, we're carrying that Thompson name, and we're going to keep it going.
Nice. Well, thank you. It's been an honor to speak with you and share this time with you. Before we end today, is there anything that maybe I didn't think to ask you, or we didn't think to ask you, that's important for us to talk about before we leave?
Goodness, we covered so much. I can't think off the top of my head. No.
No worries.
No, okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, appreciate it. Thank you so much. Like I said, yeah. Let me get started. We're starting here. Fortunately, 1850, we had a little federal law called the Fugitive Slave Act. It said that federal law, slave owners could come into a free state to get their property as long as they had documentation. We had a group here in Christiana called the Gap Gang. The Gap Gang were notorious for making money by whatever they could kill. Chickens, usually chickens, horses, cows, they would steal these and sell them for money. But they found out that they could make more money by stealing people. Now, Christiana was a haven for freedom seekers because they could find work here. They could get paid for their work. They could have days off. So they said this was the ideal life. So they wanted to be here and stay. We have one gentleman by the name of William Proctor who came here. He was a freedom seeker from Maryland, a plantation called Rodown. And he came here and he got a job. He worked and he actually had days off. So he said, "You want to stay here?" He got married, had children. And then he said that by his own right arm, he vowed to help anyone else who wanted to maintain their freedom. He would help them. So, as I said, we had a group called Gap Gang here. Among them was a gentleman by the name of William Paget. William Paget would come through town as a tinker, which meant he came here to sell wares or to help repair things. But his actual job was to look for new faces. And they would deem those to be freedom seekers. But they really didn't care if you were a freedom seeker, if you had been free, or if you were even born free. They didn't care. If you were black and working alone in the field, they would kidnap you. And they would take you and sell you in Maryland to make their money. Now, William Parker found out about this, and as I said, he vowed by his own right arm that he was going to help them maintain their freedom. So he found out what the Gap Gang was doing, and he got his own group together. They found out the route that the Gap Gang took to Maryland. So when they found out someone was missing, they got on the road and tried to get ahead of the Gap Gang. They would ambush them and take that person back. So there got to be quite a rivalry between these two groups. Now, as I said, Mr. Paget was a lookout. He found 4 gentlemen here in town that happened to belong to a man in Baltimore County by the name of Edward Gorsuch. He sent word to Edward Gorsuch that his property was here in town, and they would assist them in getting them back. So Mr. Gorsuch gathered all his documentation. He went to Philadelphia to the magistrate, showing his documentation, and they started making plans on how they were going to come and pick them up. Now, with him was his son, his eldest son, Dickinson, which is this portrait right here. He had his nephew with him. They had a couple of friends, and they were federal marshal. So they were making plans while they were in the office. But unbeknownst to them, there was a gentleman who was there to clean the office and work in the office. His name was Samuel Williams. He was an agent for William Still. Now, I'm sure we all know who William Still. William Still is known as the father of the Underground Railroad. And we have a picture of him behind that young man on the wall. That's William Still. He worked very closely with Harriet Tubman. Well, he told the story to Harriet Tubman. He told the story that he heard to William Still. Mr. Still said, "Get to Christiana and warn them what's coming." So he got on the next train to come to Christiana and give them a warning. And I'm going to slide on in so we can get some room over here. Okay. Yeah. He got on the train, but he was a little dismayed because he turned around and he saw the Gorsuch party on the same train. So he started wondering, how am I going to do this? How am I going to warn them? But luckily, the Gorsuch party got off the stop ahead because they wanted to sneak up on people. So they got there on the morning of September 11th, 1851. And Mr. Gorsuch wanted to come 4 o'clock in the morning, so he figured he'd catch them all off guard. And I think he was forgetting this was a farming community, so at 4 o'clock, they're up.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he really didn't surprise anyone. So he went to the Parker home. This was the Parker home. And he stood outside and demanded his property. Now, William Parker was inside with his wife, her sister's husband, and actually the men that Mr. Gorsuch was looking for. They barricaded themselves up on the top floor. Mr. Parker, like I said, Mr. Gorsuch demanded his property. Mr. Parker shouted out, "Get this property you want. Feel free to go out to the barn
Horses, cows, chickens, that's property. Take what you want. Well, that upset Mr. Proctor a little bit, so he actually stepped inside the house and demanded his property. Mr. Proctor came halfway down the steps and said, property, tables and chairs, take what you want. Well, this angered Mr. Gorsuch a little more, so he started quoting Bible verses to substantiate his view on slavery. Was not aware Mr. Proctor was known as the preacher. So for every Bible verse Mr. Gorsuch threw out, Mr. Proctor counted. So they were going back and forth for quite a bit, till someone in Mr. Gorsuch's party got a little antsy and fired off a shot, just narrowly missing Mr. Proctor. So he retreated back upstairs. His wife Eliza went up to the third floor and started blowing up fishhorn, which was the signal in the valley that there was danger and they needed help. So she's blowing that, they started shooting at her. So she just lowered down and kept blowing the horn. Her sister Hannah became afraid and actually said, let's give up, let's give up. Eliza picked up a corn cutter and she said, I will see you dead, for I see you back this slave. And so she was like, we'll stay, we'll fight. So while they're still doing this, she's blowing the horn. A few miles down the road was a flour mill. These three gentlemen were there. Catherine Hanway, Elijah Lewis, and Joe Scarlett, Quaker. They heard the ruckus. They decided to see what's going on. Mr. Hanway was on horseback. As he approached the house, the federal marshal approached him and tried to deputize him using the Fugitive Slave Act, which said he could not refuse to assist in the capture of a runaway. Mr. Hanway refused. And while he was atop the horse, he looked and he said, sir, I suggest you leave. Because as he could see atop the horse, he looked in the field. He saw rifles, pitchforks, corn cutters that were coming through the fields. He said, I suggest you leave because these people are willing to fight to the death for their freedom. So the federal marshal took off. He said, I'm going to get help. So in the meantime, when the dust settled, sadly we had one person dead, and that was the slave owner himself at the police station. His son Dickinson, they found laying. He had been severely wounded. They said he had like 80 rounds of birdshot in his body. So he was laying there severely wounded. Mr. Proctor found him, and being who he was, a man of compassion, preacher, he went to go get help. He went to the neighboring farm, which was the Pounders, or Quaker, and he went inside, and he's inside screaming, we need help, we need a wagon. He didn't realize someone had gone around the other way with a wagon and was already loading Mr. Gorsuch onto the wagon. And while he was in the house, they actually came in while he was there. The Pounders sisters were like, what are you doing here? And he came for help, and she said, hey, you gotta hide, because they're outside. Because actually, gentlemen with guns had come and surrounded the house, thinking they were keeping Mr. Proctor out. And they actually trapped him inside. So they put him in the basement while they get settled and got help for Dickinson. And while he was there, they ran out to the orchard for the food and clothing that they did there. They went back to the basement and got their father's clothing, had Mr. Proctor changed into Quaker clothing, because around about midnight, the guards fell asleep. So they had him dressed as a Quaker, they put the collar, pulled the hat down, and they walked right past the guards. He went into the orchard, got the supplies, and he took off. In the meantime, they brought Mr. Gorsuch's body here to hold an inquest and said to find out the actual manner of death. They also had the militia by the next morning, and they arrested 35 African-American gentlemen around town, and they held them up in the third floor. Because at one time, the train came directly in front of this building. You see behind this young man, that with the blue dots, that shows you that building is not there. So the train came and stopped directly in front of the door. So what they did, the train stopped, and they actually acquired a cattle car. And they brought all the African-American prisoners down and loaded them onto the cattle car. They took them into Philadelphia to Moynihan Prison, where they were held for trial. They also arrested these gentlemen. They too were to be held for trial. And the charge was treason, because they wanted to send a message. This guilty verdict for treason was an automatic death sentence. So they were really, they wanted to get them and send that message around town. So once they got them there, Thaddeus Stevens actually came here and spent a few days where he was interviewing people to try to get an idea of what really went on here. So he became their defense counsel. He went to Philadelphia and recruited a good friend of his, Lucretia Mott. Lucretia Mott was a well-known suffragette, abolitionist, anti-slavery. She was in all of that. She got her ladies auxiliary together and made clothing for the African American prisoners. Blue overalls, white shirts, red, white, blue neckerchiefs. And to really kind of rub salt in the wound, she marched into the courtroom with the African American prisoners and actually sat with them and knitted throughout the trial. So they were really teed off of her. So I like her style. Right. But with Thaddeus Stevens, phenomenal attorney, but with his help, it was given to the jury. And they were back in actually 15 to 20 minutes. And the verdict was not guilty, which naturally sent shockwaves throughout the South. They were angry, particularly in Baltimore, Maryland, where Mr. Gorsuch's youngest son, Tom, was in boarding school. He couldn't come on the adventure, he put it, because he was too young. But his friend helped him grieve through his father's death and consoled him. But when they found out a not guilty verdict, this friend, they were angry. They talked about revenge, how they were going to get back at them for this, because nobody was being charged with his father's murder. At some point in 2001, they actually were invited down to what was that boarding school, which is now a restaurant, but they still have the documents and the registers from the boarding school. So we wanted to take a look. So we went through the log and it was okay, there's Tom Gorsuch, his son. But what we wanted to see was who his roommate was, who helped him through all this grief and anger. The young man's name was John Rose Booth.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Yeah, we were like, what? So we were like, oh my gosh, okay, that's a whole other story. And then we turned our attention to William Parker. What happened to him? How was he faring? Because he was trying to get out of town. He made it as far as Rochester, New York. Couldn't quite get across the border to Canada. But he ran into a gentleman. Turned out they had been children together as enslaved on the same plantation. They knew one another. And this young man helped him get across the border to Canada. Turned out to be Frederick Douglass. So we were like, okay, we're really a little roster going here. But we had, in 2001, we were celebrating our 150th anniversary. And the Parkers came down from Canada. The Gorsuches came up from Maryland. The Quaker descendants arrived. The African American descendants arrived. And we had what we called a forgiveness dinner. And it was hosted by the great-great-grandson, Frederick Douglass. And what amazed us is that the Parker family did not know what went on down here because he didn't talk about it. Because you didn't talk about it because you were afraid that slave catchers would find out where you were and want to drag you back. So they kept that quiet. So he was in tears. His wife had to get up and do the talking for him. Because he said, I had to come all this way and all these years to find out what his great-great-grandfather did. He was proud, he was sad, he was a mixture of emotions. And we actually rededicated the monument out here. And we should hear a story about it. Actually, in 1911, they had the monument made, and they were having a celebration here. But the monument was sent to Christiana, Delaware. So we were like, oh, we just got to pretend here for a minute. But we did get it back. We got it back. But as we were rededicating the monument, we looked over and we saw everybody holding hands. And we looked over and we saw the Orsic's in the apartment holding hands. And we were like, so get a picture, because they had no idea who they were. So they were like, oh my gosh, they're gonna get this together. But it was a great day. And as you can see by this picture up here, these two gentlemen were the last two surviving members of the resistance. And it was at this point they wanted to take this picture because the farmer was pushing the house in because he got tired of people tramping through his fields to get to the house, to see the house, to get a souvenir. So he pushed the house in. So a few years back, Kutztown University got a grant and they did an archaeological dig to help us find the house. They found it. They found the foundation. And we actually, some of those things in that case there, we got tools and pottery and things like that that we were able to pull out of the ground. But unfortunately, because of the size of those stones, we couldn't get down into the basement of the home. So hopefully, if we ever get another grant that we can bring equipment in and actually get down there, the farmer would obviously not let us keep a hole in his field. So we had to cover it back up, but we put markers in. So
Who's on that?
that's up on Lower Valley Road.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you go along the road, you'll see a blue marker that will show you. If you look straight up into the field, it will kind of give you an idea of where the house was.
Okay.
But we have markers there so that with a metal detector, we go back, we can actually find it and hopefully get further along in dig. But these gentlemen went on to fight during the Civil War. Most of these gentlemen, I always point out Ezekiel Thompson, he was my third great grandfather. And all three of his sons fought with the U.S. colored troops during the Civil War.
Okay.
But what was sad about that is Joseph, two sons, did not make it back. They died. When they applied for their pension, and it's very clearly written on Joseph's pension papers, son of Ezekiel Thompson, Christiana Resistance, pension denied. Wow. And the same happened with his other son, Miller. Miller fought with the 3rd United States Colored Troops in Florida, battled molested. He contracted consumption. He came back and died with his 6 His wife applied for a pension. She was denied. She hired an attorney, but she was denied. So he still made that fight. But Ezekiel, they all attended a church up on the hill, Mount Zion African Methodist Episcopal.
Oh, yeah.
Yep. He attended that church, and it was during the melee here that the militia went up there and fired through the doors of the church because they thought they were hiding people there. There was no one inside, but the church still has that door with all the bullet holes, and they have the little pellets. They have it encased, and they're hiding it because the Smithsonian wanted it. Like, no, it's staying here.
Yeah.
But quite a few of these men are buried around the cemetery in that church. Ezekiel attended that church. He's buried up there. And one of the things about during their imprisonment, while we were in Mosunmola prison, they said he prayed so loudly and so fervently that there were crowds stopped on the street and just stopped to listen to him. It was that fervent in his prayer, I guess, for freedom and safety and release. But he was quite a fellow. Does anyone have any questions?
Is Father Stephen Colon, is that name here? Father Stevens?
Yes, it is.
Getting up for life.
Yes, Daddy Stevens left money in his will for school to be started.
And that's up for Lancaster. Yeah.
Yep, but one thing that he demanded in his will is that when it came time to eat, it was all boys at that point. He said they were all to sit to dinner together, not separately, together. And he stated, be they Christian, Gentile, Jewish, or Mohammedan, they were to sit together.
Yeah.
Because you see, you cannot know someone unless you talk to someone.
Like the movie, with the football, just like that. Yeah. Zach. Yep.
Yep, yeah. They said you had to get to know a person. You didn't judge a person.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that he was quite the gentleman ahead of his time. And and he actually used the South, their own prejudices against them during the trial. But they said they assumed that because they were African, that they had no intelligence. They were like animals, but they were more cunning and more intelligent than they thought. But he used that against them. They said, look at these guys think of anything. You know, they don't have the intelligence. And they bought that. So like, they couldn't do that, so they're not guilty. And it was just like, think that too. But they actually, like I said, they brought the marshal in to identify who was there for sure. And because Lucretia could Mosunmola, like, he couldn't identify anybody. He couldn't say that person was there or that person wasn't there. Very clever. Very clever. But we, out of this, I think the descendants come together often. We're still looking for descendants of these people, because a lot of them moved away naturally after what happened. They didn't want to be arrested. These folks, Elijah Lewis, while he was in jail, he sewed together a book. And in that book, he made a list of every visitor that came to see him. And you would see that, you would see William Still, you would see every major station master, conductor, abolitionist in the tri-state area came to see them while they were in jail. His great-great-grandson has the original book. So if you were over at the Masonic Lodge, you would have seen jail he has there. And that's the list of all the names that were in that book. Yes, sir.
About how far from the historical marker,
Where the house
where
was there.
was the house? Like, is it 50 feet or is it like?
Oh,
way
well,
out?
you're talking maybe like three-quarters of a mile.
Oh, okay.
If you stand at the marker and you look up in the field before the final tree line, you would see that be about where the house was.
Is the house still up?
No, it's gone. Yeah, it's gone. But if you sat outside on the sidewalk here, that bench is actually made from the door sill of this house.
Okay.
So yes, not bad. And if you look at the monument, it's placed so that Edward Gorsuch's name is facing south for his beloved Maryland. And all of those that are arrested are facing north for freedom.
Okay.
Yes.
I got a question, but
Yes,
I was on Hill where the Prince Development, we met the common ground there.
uh-huh.
That's yeah.
Oh,
That's why I know. I stopped by and looked at that church and read stuff there a lot with that, yeah.
yeah. You'll find most of these gentlemen, like I said, a lot of the United States colored troops that fought in this area are buried in there. We're still looking for descendants, like I said. A lot of people, they didn't tell the story because they were afraid. Because of, you don't want to slave catchers to come back with that too. And even I was in my 30s before I even found out about the story. And I had asked my mother, why is no one talking about it? We don't talk about that. I know. Well, yeah. That's when I started getting in trouble because I started talking about it. Here I am still talking about it. So and as they said, we just found her last year. She was 100 years old. We still got that. Give us some information about it. Any questions? Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.